Today, I want to talk about something incredibly powerful, something that lies at the very core of human potential. It's not talent, it's not motivation, it's not even passion, it's action. Daily, consistent, deliberate action, and more specifically, the ability to force yourself to take action, even when you don't feel like it. Now, I want to frame this scientifically. The human brain is not designed for comfort. It's designed for adaptation. Every time you push through resistance and take action, especially when it's hard, you're literally rewiring your brain. You're training your nervous system to favor forward momentum over stagnation. Neuroplasticity, dopamine regulation, the prefrontal cortex, these are not just neuroscience buzzwords. They are tools you can leverage to build discipline, to create habits, and to override the primitive circuitry that tells you to stay in bed, to delay, to avoid. So today, I'm going to walk you through the biology of resistance, the psychology of persistence, and the daily protocols that can help you take action every single day, even when your mind says no. Because greatness is not found in big moments. It's found in the small, often unseen moments when you choose to act despite discomfort. Action precedes motivation, not the other way around. This principle runs counter to much of the popular advice we hear today, which suggests that we must first feel inspired or motivated before we can take action. However, from a neuroscience perspective, this is a misunderstanding of how the brain and body actually work. In reality, waiting for motivation before initiating a task often leads to paralysis. The truth is that action itself is what triggers the internal states associated with motivation, not the reverse. To understand this, we need to look at how the brain generates motivation. Motivation is closely tied to the release of the neuromodulator dopamine. Dopamine is not merely the pleasure molecule, as it is sometimes called. More accurately, dopamine drives pursuit. It creates the feeling of wanting and anticipating a reward. What's important to understand is that dopamine release can be initiated not only by imagining a goal, but also by taking steps toward it. In other words, behavior leads to changes in neurochemistry, and those changes reinforce behavior. This means that when you force yourself to take a small action, standing up, writing the first sentence, getting dressed for the gym, your brain begins to register that momentum. That momentum then activates circuits within the mesolimbic dopamine system, which tells the brain something good is happening, keep going. The result is an increase in motivation, but it came after the action, not before it. There is also a concept known as behavioral activation, used in clinical psychology to treat conditions like depression. Behavioral activation is based on the principle that engaging in meaningful activity, even when you don't feel like it, can help restore a sense of purpose and energy. This reinforces the idea that mood follows action, not the other way around. When people act despite low energy or low mood, they often experience a physiological shift, increased energy, clearer thinking, and eventually a more positive mindset. At a neural level, this occurs because action recruits the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for executive function, planning, and goal-directed behavior. The prefrontal cortex can override the limbic system, the emotional brain, which is often where hesitation, fear, and procrastination originate. When you engage the prefrontal cortex through even a simple act of effort, you begin to shift the balance of power in your brain. You are training your system to move toward effort and away from avoidance. This pattern creates what is known as a self-reinforcing loop. The more often you take action, the more your brain associates action with reward. Over time, your threshold for taking action lowers. What was once difficult or exhausting becomes automatic. The circuitry becomes more efficient. You are literally rewiring your brain to favor forward motion. There's also a physical component to this. Movement activates the reticular activating system, RAS, a set of nuclei in the brainstem that regulates wakefulness and alertness. When you initiate physical movement, getting out of bed, walking, stretching, you are stimulating the RAS, which increases cortical arousal. This arousal translates into increased focus, energy, and readiness to engage. This is why athletes, performers, and military personnel often rely on movement rituals to prime their systems for action, regardless of how they feel emotionally. What's more, studies have shown that simply beginning a task, even poorly, significantly increases the likelihood that you will continue. This is known as the Zeigarnik effect, named after psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who found that people are more likely to remember unfinished tasks than completed ones. That mental tension pulls you forward and increases the odds that you'll see the task through. But none of this happens until you start. Starting is everything. So when people say force yourself, it isn't about being harsh or punishing yourself. It's about understanding the biology of behavior. You are not broken if you don't feel motivated right away. That's normal. The key is to recognize that motivation is not the spark, it's the fuel you generate through the act of doing. And once you understand that, you can stop waiting and start initiating. Use visual focus to trigger mental focus. This concept is rooted deeply in how our visual system connects to the brain's attentional and arousal systems. Most people don't realize that our eyes are not just passive cameras, they are actually part of the brain. The retina is made up of neural tissue, and the signals it sends are directly connected to areas of the brain responsible for alertness, attention, and decision-making. The way you use your eyes can influence your internal state. And by learning to control visual focus, you can access mental focus on demand. When we narrow our visual field, what's called visual anchoring or tunnel vision, we activate the brain's sympathetic nervous system, which increases alertness and primes the body for action. This kind of visual focus sends a signal to the locus coeruleus, a nucleus in the brainstem responsible for releasing norepinephrine, a neuromodulator that enhances alertness and readiness. This shift from a relaxed, broad gaze to a focused, convergent one shifts the entire brain-body state from passive to active. Essentially, by choosing to narrow your gaze on a single point, you are sending a message to your brain that something important is happening and that it's time to focus. On the other hand, when you're feeling scattered or overwhelmed, your eyes often naturally go into panoramic vision. You look around aimlessly, scanning the environment. While this can help calm the nervous system under stress, it's not conducive to concentration or task execution. By consciously adjusting your visual field, deliberately locking your gaze onto a single object, screen, or line of text, you can create an attentional gateway. This gateway helps filter out distractions and recruit the brain's prefrontal cortex, which is involved in sustained attention and goal-directed thinking. This is especially powerful in environments where distractions are high. For example, if you're sitting at a desk trying to work, but find your mind wandering, try narrowing your visual focus to just the task in front of you. Keep your eyes fixed on one part of the screen or page and don't allow them to drift. Within seconds to minutes, your mental state will begin to follow. This works because vision is the primary driver of attentional engagement. It acts as the steering wheel of the mind. There's also a relationship between visual focus and autonomic arousal. When your eyes are relaxed and scanning the horizon, your parasympathetic nervous system is more active. This is the system responsible for rest and recovery. But when your eyes converge, when they fixate, you shift into sympathetic mode, which is associated with increased alertness and readiness for effort. Athletes, surgeons, and special forces operators use this principle intuitively. Before a critical moment, they narrow their vision, locking in on a target or zone. This enhances cognitive clarity and physical readiness simultaneously. Another powerful aspect of visual focus is its impact on the dopaminergic system. Dopamine release is not just a response to achieving a goal, it's also tied to how we visually track our goals. When we focus our eyes on a point and begin to move toward it, our brain interprets that as progress. That sense of progress, even if small, leads to increased dopamine, which in turn increases motivation and drive. It's a feedback loop. The act of visually orienting to a goal sets in motion a cascade of neural and hormonal responses that prepare the entire organism for pursuit. This is why, even in simple activities like walking or working out, having a fixed point of visual reference can make a huge difference. Whether you're running and focusing on a landmark in the distance or sitting down to write and locking your gaze on the screen, the visual system is always sending signals to the brain about what matters. And the brain responds accordingly by increasing or decreasing cognitive effort. The mechanism is not just about keeping your eyes still, it's about intentionality. Choosing to direct your gaze, choosing to engage with a specific point, is a form of deliberate control. That control activates the top-down networks of attention, including the anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These regions are essential for task initiation and focus. When they are engaged, the noise from irrelevant stimuli is reduced and mental clarity increases. This principle also extends to time-blocked work. If you train yourself to begin each focus session by first anchoring your gaze for 30 to 60 seconds on a single point, you'll notice that your ability to drop into deep work improves significantly. This simple visual practice becomes a physiological signal that tells the brain, now it's time to focus. Over time, this creates a conditioned response. Your visual system becomes a switch, one that turns on focus, energy, and engagement when you need it most. Leverage dopamine through incremental wins. Dopamine is one of the most misunderstood yet powerful neurochemicals in the human brain. Often referred to as the molecule of pleasure, dopamine is actually more accurately described as the molecule of motivation and pursuit. It is not just released when you achieve something, it's also released in anticipation of achieving something. This anticipation is what drives effort, focus, and persistence. Understanding how to engage this system properly can dramatically enhance your ability to take action consistently, especially when progress feels slow or difficult. One of the most effective ways to harness the dopamine system is by breaking down your goals into smaller, manageable steps, what we can call incremental wins. These wins are not arbitrary, they serve as neurological markers. Every time you complete a step and mentally register it as a win, your brain releases dopamine. This release creates a feeling of forward momentum, which increases your likelihood of continuing to take action. What matters most is not the size of the win, but that you recognize it as meaningful progress. Whether it's writing one paragraph, completing a 10-minute workout, or making a difficult phone call, your acknowledgement of that effort is what triggers the neurochemical reward. This is where internal reward becomes incredibly important. External rewards like praise, money, or recognition can create temporary dopamine spikes, but they are often unsustainable and outside your control. Internal reward, your ability to mentally associate effort and progress with satisfaction, creates a much more durable and self-reinforcing loop. Neuroscientific research has shown that people who learn to associate effort itself with positive emotion are more resilient, more consistent, and less dependent on motivation. They begin to crave the process because their dopamine system is aligned with the act of doing, not just the outcome. To leverage dopamine effectively, it's essential to mentally note and celebrate progress in real time. This doesn't mean exaggerating or becoming artificially excited. It means learning to acknowledge that each step, however small, is part of a meaningful trajectory. This shifts the dopamine system into a mode of continuous release, as opposed to withholding dopamine until a distant goal is achieved. When dopamine is released frequently in response to small wins, it reinforces the neural circuits involved in motivation and habit formation. These circuits become more sensitive, making it easier to take action in the future. Incremental wins also serve a powerful cognitive function. They help reduce overwhelm. When the brain perceives a goal as too large or too distant, it often triggers a stress response. Cortisol levels rise and the prefrontal cortex responsible for planning and focus begins to shut down. However, when you break the goal down and achieve the first small piece, the brain interprets the situation differently. It sees a solvable problem. The stress circuits quiet down and the brain returns to a state more conducive to creative thinking and sustained attention. This effect compounds. With each small win, the next step feels more achievable and the path forward becomes clearer. There is also an element of specificity here. Dopamine is released in proportion to how specific and meaningful the perceived progress is. That means vague accomplishments don't activate the system as powerfully. If you can define what success looks like for each small step and track it, you can dramatically increase the dopamine response. This is why checklist progress bars and streak counters can be so effective. They provide visual and psychological proof of progress, which the brain uses to generate more motivation. Additionally, you can train this system by pairing effort with positive self-talk. When you say to yourself, "This is hard and I'm doing it anyway," you are reinforcing the association between effort and reward. Over time, this conditions your brain to expect a dopamine release from effort itself. That is the neurological basis of discipline, not just doing things you don't want to do, but actually feeling good about doing them because your brain has been trained to reward the process. What makes this so powerful is that it bypasses the need for willpower alone. Willpower is a limited resource, subject to fatigue and emotional variability. But when your dopamine system is engaged through incremental wins and internal reward, the drive to continue becomes intrinsic. It becomes less about forcing yourself and more about leaning into a feedback system that is naturally built for progress. This system thrives on repetition and reinforcement, which is why consistency, not intensity, is the key to long-term action. When you learn to leverage dopamine in this way, even the most mundane tasks can begin to feel purposeful. Shift identity through consistent behavior, not belief. Many people wait for a change in identity to feel ready to take action. They believe they need to become confident, disciplined, or motivated before they can act like it. But neuroscience and psychology suggest the opposite. Identity is not something you wait for or even think your way into. It is something you build through action, repetition, and behavioral evidence. The way you consistently behave sends signals back to your brain about who you are, and over time, those signals become your self-image. In other words, action drives identity far more powerfully than belief alone. The brain is constantly monitoring your behavior and updating your internal model of self. When you do something difficult, when you show up even when it's uncomfortable, your brain takes note. It says, this is what someone who is disciplined does. This is what someone who is resilient does. And the more times you repeat the behavior, the stronger that identity becomes. This happens at a neural level through a process known as synaptic plasticity. Neurons that fire together wire together. When specific behaviors are repeated, the neural pathways that support those actions become more efficient and more automatic. Eventually, they no longer feel like choices, they feel like habits, and then like traits. It's important to understand that identity is not a fixed trait encoded in your DNA. It is a set of patterns, mental, emotional, and behavioral, that have been reinforced over time. And the most powerful way to change those patterns is not by thinking differently, but by doing differently. You don't need to believe you're the kind of person who wakes up early. You need to wake up early, consistently, and your brain will adjust. You don't need to believe you're confident to speak up in a meeting. You need to speak up, and your brain will start integrating that as part of your identity. Action is what creates the proof. This is especially relevant when it comes to breaking limiting beliefs. Many people feel stuck because they have internalized certain narratives about who they are. I'm not a morning person. I've never been disciplined. I always procrastinate. These beliefs feel like truth, but they are often just reflections of past behavior. And past behavior is not destiny. By interrupting those patterns and inserting new behaviors, even in small doses, you can begin to shift those narratives. The brain is always updating its sense of self based on what you do today, not just what you did in the past. This process can be accelerated by being intentional about what behaviors you want to reinforce. When you decide, for example, that you are going to become someone who exercises daily, you don't need to do an hour-long workout from day one. You need to act in a way that someone who exercises daily would act, even if it's 5 minutes a day. That 5-minute act is a vote for the identity you're trying to build, and with enough votes, the identity sticks. What matters is the consistency of the behavior, not the intensity. There's also a psychological principle known as self-signaling. This refers to how your brain uses your own behavior as data about who you are. If you help someone in need, your brain registers that action and updates your self-concept. I'm the kind of person who helps others. The key is that you don't need external validation to do this. Your behavior is evidence enough. This is why habits are so powerful, not just because of the results they produce, but because of what they say to you about who you are. Another layer to this is the role of embodiment. When you physically act out a behavior, whether it's posture, movement, or speech, it creates a feedback loop between your body and brain. Standing tall, breathing deeply, or making eye contact can send signals to the nervous system that increase feelings of confidence and presence. Over time, these physical actions become part of your behavioral signature, reinforcing an identity of strength and composure. Crucially, this also means you don't have to wait until you feel like it to take identity-building actions. Feelings are not reliable indicators of who you are. They are transient states influenced by many variables: sleep, nutrition, stress, and more. Behavior, on the other hand, is stable, observable, and within your control. And because behavior influences how you feel, you can act your way into new emotional states and new self-perceptions. By choosing specific actions and repeating them consistently, you create a shift that is grounded in reality, not fantasy. You stop hoping for change and start building it one behavior at a time. As these behaviors accumulate, they become undeniable proof to your brain that you are, in fact, becoming the person you once only imagined. Use deliberate cold exposure to train resilience. Cold exposure, when used strategically and intentionally, is not just a physical challenge, it's a powerful tool for building mental toughness, regulating the nervous system, and enhancing your ability to take action under discomfort. The value of deliberate cold exposure goes far beyond the immediate physical sensations. It creates a controlled stress environment where you can learn to observe your reactions, override impulsive responses, and build a more resilient mind-body connection. From a physiological standpoint, cold exposure activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the body's fight or flight response. This results in the rapid release of adrenaline and norepinephrine, two neuromodulators that increase alertness, elevate mood, sharpen attention, and improve reaction times. These chemicals prepare the brain and body for challenge. Over time, by exposing yourself regularly to cold environments such as cold showers, ice baths, or even cold weather training, you train your nervous system to adapt and become more efficient at handling stress. You are, in effect, teaching your body that it can remain calm and focused in high arousal states. But the most important benefit isn't the cold itself, it's what happens in the mind while you're in the cold. When you enter cold water, your first instinct is to resist. The breath shortens, the body tenses, and the brain sends a clear message, get out. But if you learn to control your breathing, bring awareness to your thoughts, and remain still, you are developing the skill of overriding emotional reactivity. That skill is directly transferable to everyday challenges, whether it's procrastination, anxiety, or fatigue. You build a kind of mental callus that helps you lean into discomfort rather than retreat from it. Deliberate cold exposure is also a fast way to build what neuroscientists call top-down control. This refers to the brain's ability to regulate lower, more primitive parts of the nervous system using the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function. When you're in cold water and you make the decision to breathe slowly, to relax your body, and to remain focused, you are activating and strengthening those top-down networks. You are teaching your brain that it can control the body's stress response rather than be overwhelmed by it. Cold exposure also improves mood and motivation in a neurochemical sense. After even short bouts of cold, there is a prolonged release of dopamine, sometimes increasing by as much as 250% and remaining elevated for several hours. This dopamine spike is not tied to any external reward, it's purely a byproduct of effort and resilience. This is important because it trains the dopamine system to associate reward with challenge. The more you link dopamine release to doing hard things, the more you will be driven to seek out difficult but meaningful tasks in other areas of life. Another reason cold exposure is such a powerful training tool is its immediacy. You can't fake your way through it. The moment your body hits the cold, it becomes an honest mirror. There's no space for pretense or intellectualization. Your nervous system tells you exactly where your edges are, and that awareness is valuable. It gives you a chance to push those edges gradually and with intention. This makes cold exposure a reliable tool for cultivating grit and discipline, not as a vague idea, but as a lived experience. The key is to approach cold exposure with intention, not as a test of ego. The goal isn't to suffer or endure for the sake of proving something. The goal is to create a consistent, controlled environment where you can repeatedly confront discomfort and practice staying present. Even 1 to 3 minutes of cold exposure, done regularly, can produce lasting changes in your baseline tolerance for stress. You are training your brain to be more familiar with discomfort and less reactive to it. This is critical for anyone who wants to take daily action despite fear, fatigue, or internal resistance. What cold exposure reveals is that the mind is trainable in ways that are both direct and physical. By entering a state that mimics real stress and by learning to navigate it calmly, you are literally changing the way your nervous system responds to all forms of challenge. You learn to approach effort with neutrality instead of resistance. You develop an internal model that says, I can handle this. I've been here before. That belief doesn't have to be imagined or visualized. It is built into the nervous system through real, embodied experience. The adaptation that occurs from cold exposure is progressive. With each session, the shock lessens, the control increases, and the brain becomes more familiar with managing intense stimuli. This doesn't just apply to cold, it generalizes to life. The same circuits that allow you to stay calm in freezing water are the ones that help you stay focused during conflict, take action when tired, and follow through on tasks when motivation is low. Use sleep and sunlight to build baseline motivation. Most people look to mindset techniques, productivity tools, or emotional breakthroughs as the primary sources of motivation, but they often overlook the foundation that all high-performing behavior rests on your physiological state. Motivation is not just a psychological trait, it's a neurochemical condition that arises from a well-regulated nervous system. Two of the most effective and accessible ways to support that system are high-quality sleep and regular exposure to natural sunlight. These aren't lifestyle luxuries, they are biological necessities that directly influence dopamine levels, hormonal balance, and the brain's ability to generate sustained drive. Sleep is the brain's primary recovery mechanism. During deep sleep and REM sleep, the brain consolidates memories, clears metabolic waste, resets emotional reactivity, and restores neurotransmitter levels including dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. These chemicals are not just mood enhancers, they are the engines of focus, goal-directed behavior, and long-term motivation. When you're sleep-deprived, even by a few hours, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning and self-control, begins to function less efficiently. The result is a higher likelihood of procrastination, emotional reactivity, and poor decision-making. Tasks that normally feel manageable start to feel overwhelming, and small obstacles become amplified in the mind. One of the most direct consequences of poor sleep is a drop in dopamine receptor sensitivity. Even if dopamine is present, your brain becomes less capable of using it effectively. This means you may intellectually want to pursue your goals, but the neurochemical drive simply isn't there. That's why after a night of poor sleep, willpower often fails. Your physiology isn't supporting your psychology. On the other hand, when you sleep deeply and consistently, you restore not just physical energy, but the very biochemical conditions that allow motivation to arise naturally and effortlessly. The quality of sleep is largely influenced by what happens during the day, especially your exposure to natural light. One of the most powerful and underutilized tools for optimizing both sleep and baseline motivation is early morning sunlight. When you view natural light without sunglasses within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking, you activate a cascade of biological processes that align your internal clock or circadian rhythm. This light hits specialized cells in the retina called melanopsin-containing ganglion cells, which send signals to the brain's master clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That clock then triggers a timed release of cortisol, the body's main wakefulness hormone, in the correct amounts at the correct time. That early spike in cortisol is not the same as the stress-induced spike that occurs when you're overwhelmed. It's a healthy, timed signal that increases alertness, primes dopamine production, and sets a timer for the eventual release of melatonin, your sleep hormone, later in the evening. By getting sunlight early in the day, you ensure that your energy rises at the right time and tapers off naturally as bedtime approaches. This leads to deeper, more restorative sleep, which then feeds into the next day's focus, energy, and motivation. There's also evidence that natural light exposure improves mood and mental clarity, even independent of sleep effects. It stimulates the release of serotonin, which contributes to emotional stability and resilience. When serotonin is produced during the day, a portion of it is later converted into melatonin at night. This means that getting outside, even for just 10 to 15 minutes, can have a compound effect. It boosts your mood in the moment and sets the stage for better sleep and recovery later on. Light exposure also directly affects dopamine pathways in the brain. The retina has connections to brain regions involved in reward and motivation, such as the ventral tegmental area, vita, and the nucleus accumbens. When these areas receive input from bright light, especially in the blue spectrum, they become more active, increasing your sensitivity to goal-directed rewards. This enhances the salience of your tasks, making them feel more compelling and less like obligations. In short, sunlight makes you feel like doing the thing. Even small changes to your sleep and light routines can lead to significant improvements in your motivation baseline. Waking up at a consistent time, getting sunlight early, avoiding artificial light late at night, and sleeping in a cool, dark room are simple practices that dramatically impact your brain chemistry. These are not just wellness habits, they are physiological levers for self-discipline and drive. They determine how available your cognitive and emotional resources are when you try to take action. Without them, effort feels uphill. With them, action becomes a natural extension of how your system is wired to function.